First of all, I'm gonna say thanks for coming. Oh, I should pour myself a glass of water. You know, I already have like the nerves, when you present to people who feel a little nervous. I get a glass of water here for this. I can do it. All right. So I promised something modestly entertaining. I'm gonna do my best. This is my brother Jeremy. He's a big deal developer in New York City, like sort of like senior construction guy, and has built lots of high rises and such. And I once had an argument with him so fierce about all electric construction heat pumps because he was so excited about gas P-tax. Like every room has its own heating and cooling system with a gas P-tax, and I was like, buddy, think about this. You're putting in an air conditioner. Why not just make it a heat pump PTAC? Why are you running gas to everyone's room so you can have a gas PTAC? So many camping trips with fierce debates over this. At this moment, as you see him there, he is giving me the thumbs up because he's jumping into his heat pump heated swimming pool out on Long Island. That's my sister and sister-in-law, etc. To briefly introduce myself, Um, I grew up on a family farm in Wisconsin. It's pretty much sort of a back to lander situation. Got really into renewable energy. Wisconsin is the used to be the headquarters of the Midwest Renewable Energy Fair, which is the world's largest. It's Custer, Wisconsin, close to University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Came to Humboldt State University to become a high school science teacher, but got totally pulled into the engineering and sustainable building curriculum here. Uh, got started another local farm with my ex-spouse and a few other farms with other people working on it, and became an affordable housing project manager. Got to work on some of the first all-electric developments with heat pumps in California of various types, big central systems, little ones, etc. And I've been a consultant ever since. I've got a company, we've got about a dozen staff. We have designed roughly 600 affordable housing developments that were all electric and won the grand prize from, the more liberal-minded United Nations. Got their grand prize, got a grand prize from the more business-minded Building Industry Association of California. And people were like, good job, you understand how to use heat pumps. So I'm going to take you through a history because I think it's really helpful to understand where the systems have come from, to understand how to apply them into the future at all different scales. And I would love it if you ask questions along the way. You're more than welcome to. This is for you, right? So as long as you're here, you're welcome to ask questions. And you can interrupt as you go along, like, oh, tell me more, or I have something to add. Totally fine. Happy Heat Pump Week, my friends. So let's first start off with the bad old days when the only way you could reasonably get ice was to freeze it atmospherically. This is in Massachusetts in 1837, but people used to find ways to freeze ice in the desert with open air. That was done in Persia quite a bit, modern day Iran. Still structures that stand that show how to like freeze ice in the desert on a cold night. And or get it up from the mountains, that kind of thing. But getting ice, what a challenge. A huge amount of industry. So how exciting when the first ice making heat pump was created. So the guy who makes this, it's an accident or it's an insight in the moment of accidents. He's spilled ether on his hands. It's used to clean typeset, and it's really cold as it evaporates off your hand. It's evaporating because evaporating is tied to boiling. You're essentially boiling the liquid off your hand, and liquids boil at different temperatures. Some of them um, don't boil. Well, some of them will boil at like -30 Fahrenheit, -50 Fahrenheit. Some will boil at 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Some will boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Huge range. And of course, the boiling temperature is also dictated by the pressure that's applied to the material to prevent it from boiling, which is something that's used in what's called the vapor compression cycle. And this fellow, uh, James James Watson, I think his name. Anyway, I'm forgetting his last name, but he's an Australian typesetter, and you can see the little cute model made of his same machine there. If the black and white drawing there is a little bit blurry. Basically, he figured out how to both boil ether, which made ice. Like it chilled something so cold you'd get ice on it. So he's like, if I chill this by the boiling, if I just collect that ether, then I don't waste it. I'm gonna then let it cool off and go back to being a liquid. And I'll bring the liquid back. Maybe I'll have to compress it under pressure, and you see some compression happening here. I'll pressurize it to turn it back into a liquid, bring it back, and boil it again, and that will chill this ice making machine. That's what I basically did, make an ice making machine. Hugely popular. I showed you like how hard it was to get ice before. People devoted a ton of energy, and it was an international effort once this was invented. And there were a few other people who made similar machines at around the same time. You could argue over who had the first one. I'm just going to put my finger on this one, having done a fair amount of research, and say I think this is about the right thing to call the first uh, heat pump or heat pump vapor compression cycle. Just some basics before we go further into the history. What am I talking about? So, James, the ice maker here, this is an air source heat pump. He's using the air to discharge heat and therefore pulling heat out of liquid. He's making ice. So you can pull heat out of things, like say the air around you, but it could be the water, it could be the ground. You can pull heat from it. And in all cases, really, the air, the water, and the ground, they're all heated by the sun. That's the original source of the heat. The heat in the ground is not generated by like, deep magma activity and etc. It's essentially the stuff that you're gathering in the first 40 feet or so, drilling wells 100 feet, that's sun energy. And so is the water, and so is the air. So I want to just start there. So like you're essentially collecting the heat of the sun in most of these situations where like modern day heat pumps, heating water, heating the air. Then you're going to use about 1 kilowatt hour of electricity to collect 1 to 5 kilowatt hours of heat. That's the nature of this machine called the heat pump. You put some energy into it, a kilowatt hour, and kilowatt hour of heat is a real unit of heat. So kilowatt hours is just consistently used as the metric here. And you combine that, get your 1 kilowatt hour of electricity stuck into it, and it's going to be essentially converted into heat energy in this process. So at the end of the day, you're going to move to, if you start with like one here from the air or the water, and one that you add, you're going to get two. That's going to be the hot water or the hot air, up to say six. Swimming pools, you can get 10 and even 13 kilowatt hours because you're only doing, say, a 10-degree temperature lift, like what my brother is swimming in here. It's 75 degrees outside and he wants the pool to be 85 degrees. You can get like 1,000% efficiency out of that. 1,300% efficiency of a good heat pump for swimming pools because it's just a very small temperature lift, it's called. All right, so it's a basic idea of what this process of having something boil. It's important to understand that when something boils, it's going through what's called phase change. It's going from a liquid to a gas, or if it's going from a gas back down to liquid, that's phase change. It's fancy physics. Doing that process, squishing the energy or expanding that energy, from a liquid into a gas, it takes a lot of energy right there. You're adding energy in. So there's a lot of storage there, a lot of power to be done right at that intersection between gas and liquid. So back to fun story. Skip all the physics stuff. You can learn it from another spot. I'm not here to teach the hard physics. Just had one slide for that. So I like this how just to track beer because really that was the beginning of heat pumps. Freezing water into ice using the vapor compression cycle, which is what a heat pump is. Just a faint. There's a lot of different names for these things. You could call it a reverse cycle chiller. That's another name for heat pumps. So just jargon. No one's ever really exactly agreed on what to call the thing that's doing a vapor compression cycle. What do we call that? A vapor compression device? So we call it a heat pump, blah, 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 all these different names for it. I'm just going to call it a heat pump. Um, so the Liebmans folks, they are serving the first heat pump chilled beer. They're making ice, and then the ice is being used to chill the beer. Huge business. Brooklyn, New York is, of course, like the densest city. New York is the densest city in North America at that time, and essentially to this day, Mexico City, you could argue, is it's bigger, but it's not necessarily as dense. So anyway, New York City, tons of industry there, center of America's banking, etc. A lot of people drinking beer. And Liebman's is sort of the leading firm. It's important to think about how New York City and Brooklyn's role in the development of heat pumps. I'll get back to that. Just, Put a pin on it. So then over in St. Louis, we have the Anheuser-Busch family. In 1882, they're making tons and tons of ice for their beer so they can ship it into refrigerated, well, ice-chilled cars, heavily insulated rail cars. So this is an example of an ice making machine. You see how far it's come just in 20 years or so, 20, 30 years? Big, big ice making machines. Here you can see this is a bit of a cheat because this is a picture from World War One when so many men were off to war that women were doing jobs that they were not traditionally doing at that time. So it's a 1916 photo of women hauling ice because that's still how chilling was done with refrigerant, like with heat pumps, is to first make ice and then ship the ice around. Here you have 1876 Anheuser-Busch here. At this point, I should probably have those two slides reversed because they're already making enough ice in 1876 that they've got first dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of trains leaving St. Louis with beer in them. Fancy beers like Michelob and Budweiser. These are premium beers at the time that they're shipping out. They essentially lost most of their rail cars during Prohibition. They fought Prohibition hard and lost. Of course, Prohibition lasted for about 20 years. Anyone else know how many years that was? 15 years? Then we had the constitutional amendment to ban alcohol, and then we got that next constitutional amendment to undo it. Put it in the chat if you remember, or if you can figure it out. Um, okay, so Cooper, like you just point out, you know what they're doing now. Okay, I will tell you how we got here. And so maybe the first 50 years, you could really think of it as ice making. Not much else is going on besides ice making from 1854 to around 1900. I also promised to spill some tea. And so InBev, which is a tea company as well as many other things, it's a global company, they did Anheuser-Busch dirty. And Anheuser-Busch, when I was growing up, like you could go to Busch Gardens and there was rides and there was birds and zoos and things. And the Busch family had owned it consistently. They were like on fifth generation, sixth generation, and in 2008 they got hostily taken over. And so it was against their will, but a bunch of maneuvering that was illegal. But that's how this usually happens: that you do a hostile takeover, you do something illegal to accomplish it, and then 10 years later they say, "Oh, that was illegal," but there's no undoing it. It's crazy. So that's Anheuser-Busch's story. InBev did them dirty and then sold all the assets. Everything that Anheuser-Busch had, all the fun gardens and the parks and the retirement benefits, they stopped contributing to their IRAs. They stopped giving them free passes to the baseball team tickets locally. Every single perk was disappeared. Every cool thing that Anheuser-Busch had built up since their start as a big ice making and beer making sort of together company. Oh well. And oh, last note, InBev got sued recently, which they wiggled out of. They got sued because they literally watered down their beer. Anheuser-Busch like sued them later saying you can't use their name with watered down beer. And the government said like, well, they're watering it down to a quality, like they're overbrewing it, and then they're watering it down to the quality or better than what they'd normally sell. An overbrewed beer that's been watered down is not the same thing as right brewed beer. Can anyone give me an amen? Thank you. So, 1891. This is when things start going off the hook. Germany puts a huge amount of effort into throwing an enormous party in Frankfurt. It was called the International Electrotechnical Exposition, showing how to use electricity and technologies. So the left-hand side, that's Helios, the god of light, and they have this enormous room with all these gears and pistons, basically to show off light bulbs, which is wild stuff. I'll go clockwise here. So left-hand corner then, or counterclockwise, that's the race horses. Keep that in mind what electric people are really excited about electric horses. In 1891, they didn't really have much in the way of cars yet. They're just being invented. It's not a real thing much. So people would very much have horses on the mind. And like, look, someday you could ride an electric horse like this. Hey, everybody, let's get on electric horses. So, no, no, no. Oh, in the middle, it's just a lovely poster of naked people basically advertising the party. Then lower right-hand corner, that's an electric mine. Keep in mind, combustion mine, very dangerous with coal dust and methane down in mines, and explosions would kill miners. And so this was considered more safe. Still sparking, but having electric cable powered, so minimal sparking, like directly electric wired into the machines, but that's how they were getting people down into the mines. Frankfurt is a huge coal mining area. And then finally, up at the 1 o'clock position, you have a cable powered boat. So people are trying to figure out how to use electricity. And the heat pumps that I'm showing you here aren't necessarily driven by electricity. Those are combustion driven, or yeah, essentially combustion driven. I like this one. So in 1889, Paris threw their party, and in 1894, San Francisco said, "We're going to do you one better." So in 1889, they do the Eiffel Tower. Eiffel Tower is amazing, right? And it's like 4 times as big as what the San Francisco Tower here on the right is. But the tower on the left, Eiffel Tower, it's gas lit, and it was too dangerous to put gas up into the building, so they had no restaurants. Whereas when San Francisco built theirs in Golden Gate Park, they put a cafe up at 100 feet. And it was like a nice electric elevator that you went up there. People had to climb the steps in the Eiffel Tower, except for some crazy ass elevators they had. So you can just see the quality of light way clearer with electric light bulbs, and it was all mechanical with like little uh, analog computers, gears and things turning lights on to do different patterns and such. It was pretty stylish. Jessica, yes. Not only is PG&E the world's first electric utility, starting in like 1882, world's first electric utility, public utility, we also had the coolest party in 1894. And we threw out all the stops, and it was an electrification exposition, including this electric Bonnet, the Bonnet Tower, a French guy. We had our own French guy, the Bonnet Electric Tower. And like 2 years after this awesome thing, they built all the rest of the Golden Gate Park buildings at the same time for the same party. All the other basically fancy buildings, look them up, they're built for that event. They tore this thing down because this jackass of a park superintendent didn't like towers. He liked statues and pretty buildings, and he's mostly into landscaping. Fine. But he thought this was like a tacky eyesore, and even though it was the most popular tourist attraction in San Francisco, and people would definitely throw down money to go up an elevator. Never been up an elevator before. It was electric. Eiffel Tower, that thing was driven with hydraulic water, and they had water tanks on each floor. And so, like, the water would drive your elevator up and down. Very cool. Quickly replaced with electric equipment as soon as they could figure out how. And similarly, the gas lighting that you're seeing there, the Eiffel Tower in 1900, they got rid of their gas lighting because they realized it was dangerous and it was hard to operate. And then it wasn't, they didn't even get a restaurant into the Eiffel Tower until 1982. And it's all electric. And the second restaurant they put up even higher, also all electric. Because who in their right mind is that high up in the air with limited staircases and explosive gas? It's insane. Yeah, so anyway, he tore it down. I didn't show you the picture, but I have a picture of this Bonnet Tower on its side with like horses, and they dynamited it to blow it down. And we should rebuild it. It was the coolest attraction in the whole park. And you could go way up high and look at everything. So, beating a dead horse, just to give you the milieu of electrification around 1900. I'm about to show you the beginning of heat pumps, but I want to still contextualize this for you. It's like people are still thinking with horses or electric horses, and cars were called horseless carriages, you know? And this is what they were dealing with. There's a massive, explosive growth of horses in the United States, where we went from like 4 million to 28 million horses over the course of the 1800s. And horses only lived for 3 years in New York City. They live naturally for up to 30 years, certainly 20 years. Easy with a horse. Big animal. And people would just leave them on the side of the road, and they caused tons of diseases. All sorts of maggoty stuff would be grown in there and then carrying this disease and that disease. It was nasty, super nasty. New York City would clean up 500 dead horses a year, and they're also super noisy. They would start banning them in parts of the city because they're just so noisy, clip-clopping, like not next to City Hall and such. And then you'd have to take all this grass from the countryside on boats and into the city, and it got turned into poop. And you see that on the bottom there? Rich people would hire scoopers for them. So it's just nasty and stinky and explosive and gassy, and the electrification movement really started to take off around 1900. You started seeing cars, electric cars, like the electric bat was the fast, sorry, the longest distance one. It was a 5 mile sprint, beat gas cars, and they started using like 600 of these things in New York City with replacements of the batteries in an old ice rink. And Le Jamais Content, first car to get to 60 miles per hour in 1899. And in the United States, 40% of America's cars in 1912 were electric. And women loved them because you didn't have to hand crank them. There was no batteries in cars until the 1920s. And that's kind of the end of the first electric cars because gas cars finally became hybrids. Once they put a battery into electric cars to easily start them, provide lighting, put a radio in them perhaps, then gas cars really took off and squelched the electric car industry. But up to that point, just straight up gas cars, people didn't like them as much. I mean, yes, they had 60% of the market, but everyone could agree that EVs were better, if not cheaper. All right, back to heat pumps. I gave you some context. In the midst of all this technological revolution where some city is throwing a huge party every 2 years to show how to do electrification, lighting and mining and horses, Willis Carrier in New York City is hanging out seeing how ice is being made at all the big breweries. And he's like, I understand this. I have studied mechanical engineering. I'm a smart kid here from the city, and he gets hired to make a dehumidifier slash air conditioner, emphasis on dehumidifier. Air conditioning can essentially do both. You can gear it more to cool the air, or you can gear it more to dry the air. You can't do both perfectly at the same time with the same product. It's a trade-off. So he's making a dehumidifier. Why is he getting paid to do the world's first air conditioner? It's because printing color was something that people badly wanted, but you couldn't do it on wobbly pages. And the humidity levels in these printing presses were so high as they're like pulping the paper and squishing the paper, and then they're trying to make newspaper prints and such. Humidity is drippingly wet, and that would make the pages warble. And then you couldn't do one print of color, then another print of color, then another print of color. You couldn't have color, you couldn't have comics. You couldn't have color book prints. You couldn't have any of that stuff until you could figure out how to dehumidify the place where the stuff is getting printed so that you could get really accurate colors. And then starting from 1902 on, huge revolution in American printing where you get these gorgeous colors. This is like a 1905 poster here, La Loie Fuller, something like that. Anyway, that's what you can do with air conditioning. And that, there's images up there, the pages of the book, and that's what you can not do. That's what you do without it. You get it. So the next big push is in the 1930s. And it's in Switzerland. Switzerland throws a ton of money into figuring out how to do heat pumps. What they have, and they, because keep in mind, the expansion of Nazi Germany and everyone's awareness of it starts around 1932 and 1933. America enters really in 1941. So Switzerland, which did not want to be in the war, as we all recall, did not have access to fossil fuels either. What they did have is mountain passes that they could dam, make electricity. That's all over the place in Switzerland. Making electricity, and then the electricity could be used to operate heat pumps. And what is the other thing that they have? Well, being like a feudal nation, they have tons of moats. I'm not joking, moats around castles. That's where they would pull the heat from. So there were water source heat pumps in the 1930s. And this is how Switzerland stayed out of the war during the oil crunch, is that they had electrified all their municipal buildings. I mean, they even had like municipal swimming pools that they were heating with heat pumps, taking the heat out of the moat around the castle, and then pulling the heat with a heat pump and sticking it into radiant floors or, water for the swimming pools, etc. So they published a lot on it. When the war was over, it was contributed hugely to the takeoff of ground source heat pumps, which use an extremely similar. It's essentially the same technology. You're looking at the water that's in the ground. That's a lot of what you're taking out of the heat out of the ground. And a ground source heat pump is the heat that's in the water that's in the ground. And the drier the ground, the less good a heat pump is, really. A ground source heat pump. So these are just pretty pictures of early technologies there. 1940s, you know. What else is happening in 1941 when that photo is being taken? All right. So I'm having to just switch back a little bit because I want to go back into the United States here. This is Frigidaire on the left-hand side. This is the first packaged air conditioner ever made in the world. Ta-da! And yeah, 25-year anniversary is when they're taking this photo, but they're showing the old examples of it. That's the oldest, basically, photos I could find of that type of heat pump. And then starting around 1947, you see the photo on the right-hand side. That's when you start seeing that form factor coming out. Sold hugely, big sales when that specific box type came out. And it became a luxury that was available widely for people with a budget for the luxury in the 1950s. So you really see like from 1929 when the first big boxes that kind of look like refrigerators. But one thing that's nice to see, if you look at the guy kind of in the middle with the black hair, he's got his hand on this. I like how you can see the fan. To understand a heat pump, you have to understand that basically what it's doing, an air source heat pump, is it's pulling air over refrigerant-filled pieces of metal. They're called coils, although these days they really look more like fins than coils. And they're not really coiled, they're more snaky back and forth. But the old language that people use is coils because they were using them. But basically, it's a fan. Most of what is a heat pump is a fan these days. They've shrunk the components that are the compressor down to a pretty small little black capsule. Whenever you open a heat pump, you'll see the black capsule, and it's enclosed because it's under pressure and it's very sealed as a consequence. So you don't really know what's inside of it. Inside of it is an oblong, irregular shaped piston that squishes the refrigerant, applies pressure to it to make it go from gas to liquid. It's a rotating squisher. So those components are big in 1929, and the fan is relatively small. These days, it's mostly just the fan when you open it up and you look inside, and everything else has been miniaturized, made more cost effective. All right, well, there you go. The first room air conditioner, packaged air conditioner. Here we have the first packaged whole house heat pump. General Electric started out in 1949 saying, we're not really into split systems yet. We're not doing that yet, really. Split systems is not how we think about these things. Currently, we are still only imagining heat pumps as one package. Think about that. All we ever did was packaged heat pumps until we learned how to do split systems to make it easier to install. So this is what a whole house heat pump by General Electric looks like in 1949. Really big, lots of components, and that's trying to produce roughly 3 tons, 36,000 BTUs. Oh, in order to explain ton, and I think it's worth diverting, let me go back to a picture of ice. Just for a second. There we go. So when they're making ice, they measure the unit of ice in tons. And they say, how many how many tons of ice can this heat pump make? I'm going to take water that's roughly 32 degrees. Or 30, well, we're going to chill it. This water's going to be chilled, but when I make it into ice, I need a certain amount of physical capacity. How am I going to measure that? Well, I can measure it in BTUs, British thermal units, but that's essentially one wooden matchstick burnt from tip to tip is a British thermal unit. So I'm not really making heat here. Yes, I can measure it that way because I'm expelling heat, but I'm going to call my metric tons. So there's 12,000 British thermal units, 12,000 matchsticks essentially worth of heat removed from water to make a ton of ice is one way of doing it, right at 32 degrees. And if you melted that ton of ice, it would pull 12,000 BTUs from the environment around it as it melted at that spot. Once again, I don't want to get too much in the physics, but it's fun to know that the metric tons of ice literally comes from how they used to make tons of ice and how much work that heat pump needed to do. Okay, back into the 50s. So General Electric, which is a big company even back in like 1905, 1915, etc. And they're getting bigger. They're building power plants all over the nation. That's their big thing, is they build the plant itself. Big money. And they operate them. And they sell people the electricity. So they're everything there. They're a utility, they're a power plant manufacturer, and they're making appliances also that people that use electricity. And so they go big. They're like, let's hire Ronald Reagan. He's retired now. He's not really doing acting anymore. His last movie was with the chimpanzee, but he found Marilyn Monroe. He's the president of the Actors Union. So he's kind of cool. Like we can hang with him. And they put him up as essentially the host of the number one television show in our nation, advertising their own heat pumps, their room heat pumps, their whole house heat pumps. They didn't have swimming pool heat pumps at the time. This was like an electrically heated swimming pool, but that we do have swimming pool heat pumps now, of course. Um, so anyway, it was a number one show, and the goal was to get to and they literally canceled the television show once they got to this in 1962. Number one television show, cost a bunch of money to put out, and they got the National Electrical Code to require houses to be 100 amps, and that allowed you to have a heat pump that had, say, a 30 amp electric resistance element as backup and still comply with a 100 amp service with a average 1,400, 1,500 square foot house, which is what everyone is building after World War II. 1,200, 1,400, 1,600 square foot homes, two, three, even four bedrooms, just small little houses. So it really worked for how almost all the houses were being built. And I just like the Mad Men element of this. They literally hired the advertising companies that we call the Mad Men today of the late 1950s and early 1960s, drinking hard scotch and smoking cigarettes and figuring out how to shame women into buying electric appliances, like calling them a dinner duchess or a lady in waiting, and getting guys to really get invested. Like you have to have a warm, electrically heated house. It has to be comfortable that way. And like, don't forget your electric lights on your Christmas tree. Now, just getting back into heat pumps purely. Carrier, same guy as Willis Carrier from 1902. Carrier all since then. This is the guy, dehumidified a pulp mill, let us finally print in color. So his company comes out with the Spam can in 1970s. That's on the left-hand side. These are very hard things to find, so I apologize, they're kind of rusty. And then the round one in the 1980s, and these are examples of early split system heat pumps where they're still air conditioners in this case, but they could be heat pumps. Just these two are specifically air conditioners. And they're split in the sense that the fan component is outside. The condenser, like piston little pump in there, that's doing its work. It's sitting inside there. It's outside. But it's sending refrigerant that's just been chilled in the case of an air conditioner, or heated if it's a heat pump, sending it inside to some sort of fan coil. It's a fan, and they call it a coil, even it might be just little fins. And the fan blows air over those ridges or fins or coils, and it's either been heated or cooled, and that's how you get cold air or hot air through your ductwork. And this is the split version of that, which is the technical innovation that we got starting in about the 1970s. Now, I've been mostly talking about HVAC, but this is chilling milk. I'm from Wisconsin. I mentioned that, like from a farm. This is a real thing. Having a heat pump that chills your milk while simultaneously heating your wash down water so that you can wash down the barn. When you bring all the cows in, they shit everywhere. We're adults here, right? Let me just tell you, it's a bunch of green poo all over the floor. It's really wet. It smells robust. It smells kind of like beer and yeast in some ways because all the fermented grass in their guts. So it's just a whole lot, I gotta say. So you have a hose of hot water, and that hot water has been heated by the milk being chilled down because you gotta chill it so it doesn't spoil. And then you ship the chilled milk to the dairy where they then pasteurize it. That's where they pasteurize it. And then they make it into bottled milk or they work it with cheese or whatever. So the Dairy Equipment Corporation of Wisconsin, home state, home pride here, they made dairy chillers that resulted in the hot water. Whoops, there's an R missing there. The hot water and stored it for the washdown. And then they invented the first standalone heat pump water heater, the tank type that we mostly all see today, the model HP-80 spec. It's loud. Its efficiency is a COP of 2. So I mentioned at the beginning how you could have a pretty low efficiency, like 1 unit of electricity plus 1 unit of air heat that would combine to be 2. This is a COP of 2, coefficient of performance. That also means 200% efficient, all the same words. But there it is, the first one. It's 1978. I'm a 2-year-old. Down the road. Then Stiebel Eltron. They start making this heat pump water heater in Germany in 1979. And then the son, like Steeble, the son of the Theodore Steeble, he comes and he goes to Hampshire College. I think just closed last week, actually, over in Massachusetts. So he comes to Hampshire College. He's a hippie in the 70s. He says, I'm staying. This is the place to be. Way more fun than living in Germany. Bunch of stuck-ups, right? So he stays in the United States. He starts making electric resistance heaters for like bathrooms, like get your hands warm, that kind of stuff. And he brings over this product, which is really the United States' second heat pump water heater. The Thermistor, this thing here, they didn't really market it. It didn't go very far. You could buy it, but it was pretty much gone within a couple of years, sadly. So these guys come on the market, and they're essentially the only ones again. I have this yellow arrow pointing here because this is for me an insight. When I encountered this specification sheet, I realized, oh, maybe we could reduce the amount of power that's supplied to heat pump water heaters. I helped create the 120 volt heat pump water heater. I'll talk about that later. But this is like a moment in time where it says maximum available amount of 104 degree Fahrenheit water. 104 degrees is about as cold as you want water to be while you're showering and still be completely hot, but just with no cold water added. So you might be like turning off the cold water, but still having a hot shower. And they're pointing out that there's 106 gallons of that temperature of hot water in their 58-gallon tank. And if you get an 80-gallon version, there's 147 gallons of that temperature of hot water, which is a lot more than how water heaters are tested. Usually they're tested in the United States at 3 gallons per minute, so like a bathtub flow of hot water if you just left that on. So most people don't take bathtubs though. And that amount of hot water demand is hard for a heat pump water heater to catch up with. It's doing heating, but that's more heat coming out than going in. So what they're trying to point out here is that if you were comfortable with the water also dropping a temperature from 125 down to 104, which our federal test is not comfortable with, you got to keep it at 125. So it's like if you change the testing methodology, you could see that you can still get a lot of hot water out of a tank that's stored at 100, well, stored at 125 Fahrenheit. So insight, but this is when we start getting nice heat pump water heaters. I point this out also because you can think of about how much time we've wasted. Sometimes we all feel like, oh, we're just rushing into the future with electrification. Or you can think like, we've been dragging our heels. Like this is a renewable energy collector. This is a solar thermal collector. This is the same thing that Carter was putting on the White House in 1978. Now we've got like a souped up electronic version of it that's using refrigerant instead of propylene glycol, which technically is a refrigerant, but it doesn't go through phase change, so it doesn't do lots of energy storage the way a heat pump does. So upshot of it is that I sometimes feel like we're not that fast. So here in 2001, this is the first carbon dioxide heat pump water heating that's being done. This is kind of a big deal. This is the most efficient type of water heating we can do. And it's also some of the most efficient air conditioning. These are used in Autobahn cars. It's an expensive air conditioner to make a CO2 refrigerant air conditioner. It has to be very, very high pressure. But if you can do it, you have a non-flammable refrigerant. And on the Autobahn in Germany, cars light up in flames from their air conditioners overheating when they're going 130 miles an hour or faster down the Autobahn. So really fast cars have CO2 air conditioners in them that are pricey but safe. We don't see that at all in the residential market. There's no such thing as a CO2 direct air conditioner. There's water heaters, but there's not air conditioners. So check this out. Japan has, because the way that they bathe, first you take a shower to clean off, and then you get in a big sitting tub, 100 to 150 gallons. And your whole family does this. It's one night. But it turns out that Japan is, instead of having, say, 15% of their electricity, they're using a 30%, 40% of their electricity was going into water heating and just energy in general. They have coal in Japan. They don't have much fossil fuels, and it's also sort of problematic to get propane out into rural areas, particularly. So rural areas needed a water heater that wasn't using propane but was using electricity very efficiently. And these pincers not having propane. needing to use electricity, but it just consuming too much to use electric resistance. You see here on the right-hand side that the sales were now they've got like 10 million carbon dioxide heat pump water heaters installed in Japan as of 2024, heading into 2025. So this is the CO2 is a different beast. It heats water up to hotter temperatures. You can get CO2 heat pump water heaters up to say 190, 100, 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Certainly the residential ones go up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, easy pie. The products like the thermistor and Stiebel Eltron, those are taking heat, getting it up to 130, 140. Not that they couldn't technically get it up to 160 or 170. The refrigerants they're using can technically do that, but it's not how they're kind of designed and it's not how they're used. So CO2 is heating water up hotter. It has a coefficient of performance of 4.5, and most of the refrigerants used in these have coefficients of performance of 2.5. So 250% efficient versus 450% efficient. So they got what they wanted. They wanted a super efficient heat pump water heater that could provide a lot of hot water for storage for their large episodes of hot water demand, showering plus keeping a large sitting tub hot. And we have been the derivative beneficiaries. In 2002, so the year after, they start making eco-cutes. By the way, eco-cute is it's a Japanese word that kind of sounds like the word eco-cute in English. And Japanese are very aware of English, and so they called them eco-cutes because it sounded good in both English and Japanese. And they're like a little sad that Americans never really caught on with them. We still haven't used their eco-cutes. They just, you know. Okay, so here, EMI Enviromaster International, Water Saver. This is my partner, Michael Winkler. He, in 2002, installed this in his almost all-electric house. Became my business partner in 2011, but 10 years earlier, he was going for it. So we got this hot off the shelves Watts water saver heat pump water heater. And this is kind of the standard form factor, similar to the Stiebel Eltron. Um, Nothing, this is like a picture in his house. That's all. It's kind of neat to see. This is when they started coming along, just to emphasize that we had them. We've had them for decades. Next big move forward. CO2, that's a big move forward. Using computers in heat pumps to control them in exact ways, also a huge step forward. Think about when you were a kid. Do you remember how much you wanted to have like a 10 speed or 16 or 18 speed when you just had a single speed and you like stepped on the brakes and it skidded? You couldn't even like pedal backwards and just sort of idly go down a hill or something. The pedals were always moving if you're going down a hill. That kind of stuff is what heat pumps have been since they were invented up till 2009, with the exception of two speeds. But essentially, they're always just one speed. Just they're on or they're off, and you can't stop it unless you turn it off. Then they added home computers. And we all probably can remember how in the late 1990s we started to see expensive home computers, but they were available like from Apple and some of the PCs. And then in the early 2000s, people started to get cell phones, right? Computers got small. And that's what happened with heat pumps as well. And it's so important because heat pumps don't need to be always at the fastest speed, which is essentially how they're run. Fastest speed that they go or off. And that's no fun. Like who drives through a school zone at the fastest speed and then turns their car off and then turns it back on and turns it off? But that's what a spring day is like. It's just a calm day. You don't need to, race around running a heat pump for your house except a little bit. Like, so having it be able to turn down as well as during high temperatures, like for air conditioning in the summertime or really cold winter times, also having a computer that can run it into overdrive to say, yes, I know I'm rated to put out 20,000 BTUs, sure, or 2 tons, 24,000 BTUs. But I actually can put out 30,000 BTUs if you run me super fast. I only want to do that for like 30 minutes. Don't do this the whole day. But if you have a cold snap or you really need to get the house warm, go ahead, ramp me up. Computers can do that. It allows them to be quieter most of the time. It allows them to also, like I said, go overdrive and underdrive. And you might say like, well, how many speeds does it have compared to a bike? It's more like 100 speeds. It's essentially what you're getting is a 100-speed bicycle out of it. And you might think like, well, what's the difference between the 100-speed and 1 speed? Fair. It's a 4-to-1 turn down ratio. 24,000 BTU heat pump with a really good computer in it can go down to 6,000 BTUs. That's its ramping up and down, which is terrific because you almost never need a 24,000 BTU heat pump if your house is rated for that. That's 1 hour peak at 3 a.m. on January 1st. Pretty much how they rate it is like 3 a.m. on that day. Well, all the rest of the hours of the year are not that hour, and you almost never need that much, either for heating or cooling. And so it's so nice to have a computer because usually your system is much quieter than in full blast, whereas old-fashioned heat pumps only operate at full blast and are annoying as a consequence. You know, you don't need someone to yell in your ear. That only happens at like concerts, and you'd like them to not yell in your ear too much because it hurts. I got into designing all electric apartments around 2007. It was when the USDA put out a challenge for zero net energy rural housing, and I was a rural housing, affordable housing developer. So these are all the products I became familiar with. 2009, it was when GE Geosprings came out, and in between 2009, then we also had Rheem put out theirs and A.O. Smith put out theirs, and the Steve Beltran was always there, just trucking along. They're still sold. They look exactly like that to this very day. They're very nice heat pumps. And then Colmac came out with the first heat pump boiler for apartment complexes. This is great because Hawaii desperately wanted them. Almost all the construction in in Hawaii, pardon me, is all electric. Um, they don't have any domestic fossil fuels of any type. All of their fuel oil that's shipped over, which is the only fossil fuels they get, is shipped over domestically because of a law that requires all boats come from the United States if they're to the United States, if they're delivering fuel domestically within our country. So they can only get United States oil, not anyone closer to them. And then they have to reprocess the oil into something kind of like natural gas to get it to go through pipes and have all their appliances specially fitted for this specific type of gas, etc. It's a big pain to try to get gas in Hawaii. So they're more than 70, close to 80% all electric construction. Also the state with the highest penetration of rooftop solar. And this is what you might call rooftop solar. You put this heat pump water heater up on the roof. You're collecting heat from the air, plenty of it in Hawaii, day and night, and it heats the water, pulling heat out of the air into the water, and then you have a cheap boiler. And this has been selling like hot cakes in Hawaii. Heat pump boilers, because you have an electric boiler now, and this is definitely going to cut your bill in half. Could cut it by 2/3. You get a CO2 heat pump water heater, like, oh, I think I've cut it down to like 17% of what it was before. Heck yeah. So that's what's going on right now in Hawaii is significant retrofits as electric boilers get retired. Um, yeah, the eco cute. I just saw your chat there, Copper. So then this I want this to illustrate for you why um, all electric construction has been leading in rural America, which is most of the land mass of America is rural, keep in mind. So this is an example. In 2015, this is the first time the state of California ever funded tribal housing. I want you to think about that for a moment, since California has been funding affordable housing for other tax-paying Californians for since the 1960s. But this is the first time I got to work on it. This project was underfunded. It was a pilot. Like, should we actually give people, Californians who are tribal folks, should we give them affordable housing access? I just like th things are so socially wrong sometimes. So unfair. So they didn't get enough money. And I had to show them this table here to say, like, okay, when you're doing this design, think about what this means. This is pretty darn accurate to how it works. If you have a really efficient propane furnace and water heater, AFUE is the furnace, energy factor is the water heater, say they're both high efficiency, then your overall bill for electricity is still 28 bucks, $51 for propane, 79 for the total. If you do it all electric, just using sort of the average of the products that we'd have there for the HVAC system and the water heater. These numbers, COP of 3.2 is roughly in between those two. It'd be 59 bucks, significant savings. If you add the solar array, which you can see from the photo, and this is tribal elder housing for the Yurok and Hoopa Indian tribes. So it's 5 bucks. And that's what they did. They built that way. And when they built it, they didn't even have money left for landscaping. It was just gravel. It looks nice now, but they had the solar arrays up and they built it all electric with heat pumps. Like this is way cheaper to build with a heat pump than it is with propane, even efficient propane. Now I mentioned how Steve Eltron gave me part of my inspiration for this 120 volt heat pump water heater idea. There's also a ton of field research that we've done studying apartments, hundreds and hundreds of apartments actually, to say like, it doesn't seem like people hardly ever actually use that electric resistance element. And we get like Energy Commission funded, and even when they are using electric resistance element, they didn't need to. The water wasn't actually that cold, and the demands that showed up after that, they could have met with the existing heat that was in the water heater. And so after 6 years of research, I'd been working for about 3 years with General Electric, but they got sold to a Chinese company called Haier, and they exited the what I was hoping they were going to be the 120 volt heat pump water heater innovators in 2016. They weren't. In 2018, we had a big conference, and Rheem in 2021 came out with the first one, and now A.O. Smith and LG and General Electric, they've all come out with 120 volt versions of heat pump water heaters, which is a great delight because it means you can just plug it into any old outlet. And some of them have electric resistance elements in them, like General Electric and A.O. Smith. They have 900-watt elements in them. So you can still plug that into any water heater, but you have some redundancy in case your heat pump isn't working because it's maybe too cold outside, but LG has an inverter in theirs. Or maybe the heat pump broke, right? We still have an electric resistance water heater in there. So Rheem does not have an electric resistance element in there. It's a little bit less expensive, better probably for warmer climates generally. Now, this is the trend lines, the story I've been telling you and trying to explain like how heat pumps have demonstrably lowered bills, operating bills in rural areas for a while now. So in the upper left-hand corner, in 2014, the Propane Education Research Council hired consultants, big deal consultants, to help them understand a crisis that they were seeing, which was that everywhere in yellow there, that's where propane is being beaten out by electrification in market share of like what fuels are being sold. Because essentially the propane industry is realizing that they were losing their shirt everywhere in the whole country. But it's also interesting to see that's propane is dark blue. You can see how few places where they were gaining market share, which is what industries like. But also note that in light blue, that's natural gas. Where is natural gas gaining market share in 2014, 15, and 16? Not almost anywhere, not even in California are they gaining market share. They're losing market share to all electric construction. The Propane Education Research Council published this big paper. I found it. I was like, this is awesome. Page 14 puts its finger on it and says the problem is since 2009, they've been having computer controlled heat pumps, and they're more efficient and they're keep producing heat up in like Michigan and Wisconsin and places like that. And this is going to continue to be a problem. And it has been. Absolutely. So, in 2020, to the right-hand side, this is a snapshot of construction in the United States. This is before there's been any policies. This is no policies, just natural market forces up to 2020. No electrification movement in 2020, not to speak of. Like maybe a tiny bit in some of the cities of California, but not nationally. So you can see how Florida is 77% all electric construction, and Hawaii is 72% all electric construction as is in those years. California's just 8%. That's policy driven. That's the one of the only places you can say that the state heavily discouraged all electric construction because of the 1973 and 79 oil embargoes and convinced them that oil-based electricity was too expensive, which is true, although not true of hydro. Anyway, so the trend here is that heat pumps work in the wintertime in the south. And so you see green states where heat pumps work pretty much. And you can see like neighboring Arizona is at 40%. That's natural. California would be at 40% if our California Energy Code hadn't discouraged it. So that's what natural looks like. Okay, so then on the lower left-hand corner, I mentioned how 2020, that's like the first year that people started to talk about maybe we should be electrifying. And you see how all of a sudden heat pumps and gas furnaces joined up in sales that year. This is an international movement. I don't mean to only localize this in the United States. Europe had been banning gas boilers since 2016 in cities and in states and in countries. So all over Eurasia, people have been seeing a movement in Western Europe away from gas by law. The United States picked it up a few years later. Okay, so here we go. US sales, it's neck and neck, and then all of a sudden 2022, where we start seeing like the Inflation Reduction Act kicking in, and you see heat pump sales have been higher ever since. And this is also true globally. Although the United States is the leader in the world in heat pump sales, which is kind of cute, right? So then here in the middle, this is gas and electric water heaters. Electric could mean electric resistance, but probably not. In this case, you see the same phenomenon where gas water heaters are ahead of electric up until 2020. And all of a sudden it's neck and neck for a couple of years. Then in 2022, it takes off where you start seeing probably because all the other numbers on heat pump water heater sales is that they are an exponential growth curve. I don't have data disaggregated by electric resistance versus heat pump, but it's hard to explain this trend line is not being significantly caused by heat pump water heaters when you consider the heat pump water heater data. And then this is the 2026 new power grid. People understand now that heat pumps collect energy from the air or water or ground, but mostly we're using air source heat pumps, and that they're using electricity to collect renewable energy. And it turns out that it doesn't even matter if you are in West Virginia, which is like a 92% coal burning electricity state, even there, plugging in a heat pump to do space heating or space cooling produces less total pollution than putting a gas furnace in the house or a gas water heater because of the way heat pumps collect a lot of their energy from the air. Ta-da! So, we have now, I think, a national consensus that heat pumps generally are the way forward for water and space heating, which is roughly 90% of a house's gas loads. If you look at like, oh, what if they're using gas for the water heater, space heater, laundry dryer, and stove? 90% of that gas is those two loads there. And that's where heat pumps can be used easily. Dryers have heat pumps too. So you can just see that even with all of the aggressive anti-renewable energy talk and bluster and policy and the rest of it at the federal government level, the way that power plants are actually being built in the country is the same as it was last year and the year before and the year before, which is that it's 93 to 97% renewable energy batteries and with like solar, wind, and batteries changes a little bit. Batteries keep on growing and growing, and solar is growing as well. And as we know, while wind is growing for sure in the Midwest states, all Republican controlled governor and legislature states, that's where they're building tons to this moment. On land wind turbines, offshore is not growing at the moment. Well, it's growing a tiny bit. So that's the hour that I promised to give you guys a bit of a history. I could talk more, and if you guys have any questions about some of the systems you've seen. I kind of this is the last thing I had to say about HVAC systems, but there's certainly been new small packaged heat pumps which I showed earlier, like the Frigidaire model from 1929. They've made those into boxes of different package shapes, and sometimes that package can sit on the ceiling, and sometimes it sits on the wall, and sometimes it kind of sits on the floor. Sometimes it's in the floor. Sometimes it's in a closet. But essentially, it's just always a box, and all it needs is access to air to come into it, which means you either put it on a wall where there's air outside, or sometimes you can even duct air to it and away from it, which you're seeing people do with heat pump water heaters, because this is a packaged heat pump, and sometimes people are putting ducts to the air vents. I see it all the time, honestly. Um, you said, is the quilt product, Nancy? You asked, is the quilt product new tech in any meaningful way? No, I don't mean to be at all critical of it. I'd love a really high quality ductless mini split heat pump. But their main features are good service, a high efficiency heat pump, of course, which there are many. A nice aesthetic, they'll put decorative covers on them. But Japan is the world's leader in heat pump design. Bar none. I showed you the EcoCutes. They were also the first people to incorporate inverters into their heat pumps. This is a Mitsubishi Electric line set that I have here from small to large, from smaller houses to larger houses, basically, is what that looks like. So if you were to go to Japan, you would see quilt-like heat pumps 15 years ago. They were everywhere in Japan. People were putting in heat pumps instead of electric resistance. Once they especially got like little computers and they're so efficient because Japan is constrained, similar to Switzerland, no, and similar to Hawaii. They have very little fossil fuels. They have coal. That's what they got, but they don't like burning it, obviously. So yeah, it's just very nice. And you're welcome. It's a nice heat pump, and it is certainly one of the nicest looking ones in the United States. I don't I'd say they're new here. I don't mean to imply that they aren't a step forward for the United States. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'll release you into your evening. I totally appreciate you spending an hour with me to celebrate heat pumps. And, I'm going to go backwards just because it's kind of fun to see the history in reverse in case you forget it. Like, the milk cans and the early split systems and all the effort to sort of make it so you could put heat pumps into homes, the early packaged ones. Paul, you asked, do you know of any analysis of district thermal-based heat pumps versus air source heat pumps? Um, Analysis that I could point you at that's like printed, no. Do I have plenty of opinions on the topic? So the basic idea behind a district thermal is that they're ideally is either very dense housing, cities can do that. And I've seen it, for instance, in New York City right now, there's a big challenge. The governor had funded it where people planned and implemented conversions of a building. Now, when you are every 16 apartments equals one city block of housing, 16 houses per block is a standard old town city block. So imagine one building has 300 apartments in it. Very common you might see in New York City. 200 apartments. Well, it's for easy math. Let's call it 160 apartments. So it's 10 city blocks going up. That's a neighborhood. And the way they've been doing thermal networks just now very effectively is saying the interior core of this building is so hot that we air condition it during the wintertime. And so instead of just dumping that heating that we are air conditioning to the core of this building out on the roof while at the same time heating the exterior of the building, they're starting to use what they might call water source heat pumps, but essentially a heat pump that's pulling, like the system you're speaking of, from the core of the building to the exterior. And so you might see 10 city blocks worth of housing in a building doing it just internally. And then the next phase of that is what if you did it with the building next door? What if we started to have large networks where if you have air conditioning loads, you can feed it in? And so Stanford University has a good system for doing this. They pull heat from a pond near the university. So that's for wintertime. They chill the pond. And in the summertime, they heat the pond up. It's not for frogs. And they heat the pond up and cook that pond with their air conditioning. And then they have a whole bunch of water tanks that balance so that they're not always having to just waste it. They're mostly putting it where it's needed. So I could point you to various scales of these thermal energy networks, but they require scale. When you're looking at single family houses on a city block, they're usually all going to be in the same mode at the same time. They're either air conditioning during the summer or heating in the wintertime. So there's not sharing so much of waste heat and energy. That's not much of what's happening there. And then you run into the challenges, long distances between the buildings, and these infrastructure costs are significant. Any amount of piping, like when you're doing an air source heat pump and you're doing the piping from the split system outside in the spam cans here, inside, that refrigerant is the same. You are running refrigerant essentially in between buildings in a thermal energy network. It might be water or it might be something else like propylene glycol, but it's some liquid that you're putting heat into or pulling heat out of. Anyway, plumbing is expensive. So this cost-effective analysis usually breaks down at houses, and it makes sense with dense buildings. And it makes sense when there are mixes of uses because commercial uses like selling clothes and things usually have air conditioning loads, and houses so frequently have heating loads. So you just need to have ideally a mix of uses in an area, which you find in dense cities, but you don't really find in the suburbs. Like you just probably wouldn't be a good idea um, cost effectively. Luke, oh, So that's my answer to Paul. I hope that worked for you. I can't, I think it's worth studying, but it'd always be specific to your neighborhood and the project. It's not like an easy answer for everybody. North, you asked, why isn't the adoption rate higher? Just the cost and complexity of fuel switching? Well, all electric construction in California is at about 80% as of November last year, up from 1% in 2019. Massive change. That's in new construction. In existing construction, you might actually save money by electrifying when you have an air conditioner go out. You're like, okay, I'm going to make this a heat pump. The difference between an air conditioner and a heat pump is sometimes it's about 10% difference in cost for the product itself, and that's really it. That's it's a cheap extra cost if you're replacing the air conditioner, but when replacing the gas furnace, it's definitely cheaper to put in a gas furnace versus putting in a heat pump and replacing the air conditioner. So sometimes it gets a little bit messed up. The best opportunity is, for the 86% of Americans who have air conditioners is just to make sure their next air conditioner is a heat pump. And that goes fast and easy. But yeah, the fuel switching going from gas to a heat pump requires the contractors to be willing to do it. And usually the contractor is very wedded to their gas furnaces and they're not necessarily a dual fuel contractor that does both air conditioners and furnaces. You just run into a lot of problems. And the problems are not as extreme in places that are familiar with heat pumps, Hawaii, Florida, Arizona, but they're pretty extreme in places like California, where only 6 years ago, 1% of the construction was all electric and no retrofits, essentially none. Maybe my partner, Michael, but none of the incentive programs in the States would even tolerate you participating. Even for new construction, my all electric new construction were forbidden from getting incentives or rebates from the utilities, PG&E, SoCal Edison, up until 2017. They wouldn't give me money, no matter how efficient it was. They were just complete dicks about it. He said, we're all adults here. And I was very angry about how much work we do. Like, no, no money for you because you didn't put gas in. Um, Luke Morton, totally random question for fun. Have you read Mosquito Coast? I only saw the movie and it kind of scared me, to be honest. And I didn't realize it was about heat pumps. Really? Luke, take yourself off. Are you still there? What are you talking about? Um, Well, anyway, you guys, I hope you all have a great evening. Thanks for sharing some time with me. And yeah, happy Heat Pump Week. Take care.